Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BRIC Town Hall, Brooklyn for Sale, the Price of Gentrification. We're really happy that you've chosen to join us, and there are several ways that you can do that tonight outside of just watching. We'll get into some of those things a little bit later, but we always like to start off with a sort of statement of intentionality and let you know just why we're here. And while I'm still wrestling with that one myself, I can tell you that this is our second live town hall that we're bringing to you. We've had two others on racing and civil rights, and the lines were very clear there, right? We had people who were literally losing their lives in the street at the hands of others. But tonight, the question is a little bit more skewed. How do you talk about gentrification when you may feel like you're the victim and the perpetrator? We're going to try to get to the root of that and a lot more tonight with some very esteemed guests and a wonderful crowd that's assembled here. So before we do, I'm very proud to introduce you to a man who has done some extensive work on this subject, and you may even say he wrote the reports on affordable housing, New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is really great to be in the BRIC House live to talk about an issue that really matters to New Yorkers. And I just have a couple of minutes, so I want to just put this out there right now. Skylines in the city change. That's what New York is about. But here's what's missing. Skylines are changing without the input from local neighborhoods. And in so many places all over the city, the bottom line is that so many people moved to neighborhoods a generation ago that nobody wanted to live in. There was no developer that wanted to help you come into a community. There were no people setting up businesses or building schools. Community folks did that. People moved to neighborhoods and created all of these incredible communities. And now at a time when land value is going up because of the sweat equity of people who live in our communities, there are people, speculators, who want to evict entire neighborhoods, and we can't let that happen. And I will tell you that the way that we begin a process of fighting back is by organizing at the grassroots level. We need to go back to the feeling of community-based planning. Decisions cannot be made from City Hall and the developers all the way down to the community. And that's why we issue our reports and talk about why we have to begin to create neighborhoods that take into consideration schools, infrastructure, affordability, making sure that small businesses can survive and that generations can live together. Listen, I'm 54 years old. I got a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. I do not want my kids to have to live in Iowa and Montana because I can't afford New York someday. They got to take care of me the way I'm taking care of them. And that is something that we have to deal with. We cannot lose our communities, and we cannot break up the fabric of our neighborhoods. But at the end of the day, and I think this panel is so equipped to talk about it, we have to go back to our community boards, to our community-based organizations, and as we think about building affordable housing, as we think about recreating the neighborhoods of New York, it has to be also about keeping everybody together. Last thought for all of you, and you know this, we speak 170 different languages from 200 countries. We are the envy of the world. But why would we want to separate and gentrify? Why can't we bring people together and build neighborhoods from the bottom up? When I was growing up in Washington Heights in the 1970s, we had redlining, we didn't have banks, we didn't have investment. But we had people in the neighborhood who watched out for the kids. Every day we knew that if we did the right thing, we got to school, we tried to have a life, that we would elevate. Today, the feeling is that people want to separate communities and separate neighborhoods, and that can't happen. So the fact that we have lost 400,000 apartments that rent for less than $1,000 a month over the last 12 years tells all of us that we have a housing crisis that must be dealt with, and it must be dealt with now if we're going to be the great city that we are. Enjoy this forum. Really, I just want to say to Brian, thank you very much. You're a tough interviewer, so watch out for this guy. But let's start organizing and stop agonizing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comptroller. So glad you were there. So again, thank you, New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer, and thank you all for being here. Allow me to introduce these people right now. This is Jarrell Ben, who is from the Flatbush Tenants Coalition, who, yeah, you can clap for them. They've been doing the work for a long time on the ground, and Jarrell is one of the lead organizers there. Thanks for being here, Jarrell. Next to Jarrell is Neil DeMouse, who is an author. You've seen his work all around the city in local and national publications, and I'm happy to say he's the author of a forthcoming book that is the fight for Brooklyn. Brooklyn Wars. Brooklyn Wars. Neil DeMouse. Next to Mr. DeMouse is the New York City Council member from the 36th District, which includes the neighborhoods of Bed-Stuy and North Crown Heights, which don't know anything about gentrification. Robert Cornegy is here. All right, next to Council Member Cornegy is Ron Shiffman. Along with being a Jane Jacobs Medal winner, Mr. Shiffman has been a pioneer in urban planning and is also a professor at Pratt. Thanks for being here, Mr. Shiffman. We appreciate it. And Juan Ramos is here from the Brooklyn Triangle. They are in the fight for sustainable, local, sensible development for one of the best neighborhoods in Brooklyn, in my opinion. And thank you for being here, Juan. We appreciate it. And finally, allow me to introduce you to Sharon Zukin, who is a pioneering professor in a field called urban sociology. And she's the author of several books on the subject and a thought leader in the field. And we welcome you to our panel tonight. So thank you for being here. Just as a housekeeping note, I should let you know we are live on Brooklyn Independent Media. Thank you for tuning in, whether you're online or watching at home or from the stoop or the theater. Thank you for being here in the Brick House. And we're also being broadcast live on WBAI through our broadcast partners there. So wherever you are, you can tune in. And we also want to let you know we're in the Twitterverse and online. Throughout this evening's discussion, we're going to be running some of your live tweets on the wall behind us. So whether you're sitting here, you're listening online or on the radio, feel free to use that hashtag #BeHeard to share your thoughts or concerns or questions. Now, we really wanted to get to the essence of what gentrification is. When we were planning this thing, we had so many back and forth meetings and all-out shouting matches in the best friendly at work voices way about what gentrification is and the effects of the thing. So we decided, instead of us giving what we thought, we would go out to Brooklyn with our team, and that's exactly what we did. So allow me to share with you the street eye view of gentrification, as told by Brooklynites.
Gentrification is forced homelessness.
Gentrification to me is having to live in a neighborhood you never would have thought of living in because you can't afford to live in the neighborhoods that you would normally want to live in.
It's a beautiful thing that people who've been here through the hardships for 15, 20 years get to experience it until they get kicked out.
Gentrification means to me change.
Well, I don't know what gentrification means.
Gentrification to me is money, something that's provided for the middle and higher class.
Gentrification means
Safety.
Mixed community.
Moving out. Para mí significa nueva comunidad.
So that was just one afternoon toward a definition of gentrification. That was people on the streets. So I've got a few people who've been thinking about the idea. So I'm going to start with you, Jarrell. What is your working definition of gentrification?
Wow, you're starting with me, huh?
Starting right with you. You're in the hot seat.
Okay, as an organizer on the ground, you know, I would consider gentrification to be the integration of new peoples. Typically what I've been seeing is, as the video mentioned, higher income than the people who were living there already, just an integration of new people coming into the community. So that's like a basic definition, just the integration of new people coming into a community.
Professor Zukin, take us to class on gentrification.
It's true that new people come in and they are higher income people, usually more highly educated people, so they have both economic capital and cultural capital. They have a lot of resources and they can command more space in the neighborhood than the people who have been living there for some time. So gentrification starts out as a class issue, but it can also become a race issue, and it can become a lever of displacement. It all depends on how far you trust the market to regulate neighborhoods.
Neil?
Yeah, I think to what was just went on in the video, you know, gentrification is not just about change, obviously. You know, there are neighborhoods that change all the time in Brooklyn and in all over the place in all kinds of directions, and that there isn't that same pushing people out aspect. Money is obviously a huge factor, and I would add power. That gentrification is always a matter of people with power to define what the neighborhood is about coming in and deciding that, and the people who may have been living there for a very long time not having say in that.
All right, Juan.
I think for me that definition has changed over the years, and every single day I added another element to it. But I would say that it's a process by which people who have lived in a community for a long time have now, and cultivated that community, are now forced with moving out based on the social conditions that are coming about. So it is about that economic class. It is about that being forced out because of the rents. But it's also, I have to say, bad policy. Bad policy by the city. Bad policy by the city and how they do rezonings.
Okay, it's nothing personal that I'm going to the council member after a note about bad policy, but council member Cornigan, your definition.
So Brian, do you want my council member political definition, or do you want my person who lives in one of the most gentrified areas?
Give us your kitchen table version.
Oh, my kitchen table. Well, that starts with an anecdote. My wife and I were in a debate over gentrification, very heated debate. And the people at the debate turned to us and said, we're talking about you. Because my wife and I had gone away to college, come back with graduate degrees, and found ourselves being considered gentrifiers, even though my dad was a pastor in that area and my wife's father was an entrepreneur for their entirety in the community. So it's a very touchy subject, as you can imagine.
Professor Shiffman.
Well, I don't really like to talk about gentrification. I like to talk about the problem that comes from bad public policy, and that's the displacement of people. And I remember when I first started working in Brooklyn. I'm sort of the old man on the panel, the old person on the panel, I started working in Bed-Stuy in 1964. And the issue that we were addressing then with the Central Brooklyn Coordinating Council and other community-based groups was how do we stem the outflow of people, the displacement of people. And what we saw in Brooklyn at that period of time was disinvestment. And the victims of that disinvestment were poor people. What we're seeing now is a lot of reinvestment and accelerated investment, and the victims of that are poor people. So it gets back to the first panel you had a couple of weeks ago. The issue of race, the issue of class, the issue of discrimination is intimately woven into the issues that we're discussing here today. How do we come up with public policies that benefit people who are of low income in such a way that they're not driven out of the neighborhoods that they strove and worked hard to build? And if you look at Bed-Stuy, you look at Crown Heights, you look at Fort Greene, those communities survived because people came together and kept those communities alive. And it's their success that is now facing them right in the face with the problem of being pushed out, because now those areas are very desirable.
So speaking of that desirability, I know that you were there for the beginning of the Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation. You were one of the people who sort of pioneered this effort to bring that center and that energy to Bed-Stuy. What is it going to take now to keep the people who have been there for the duration in the community to enjoy those benefits?
Well, you know, I have to be honest. I don't think there's anything that's on the horizon by the city, state, or federal government that's going to be able to do that, because you can't turn crap into gold through some sort of alchemy. We need to generate the resources by which to reinvest in our neighborhoods to produce low-cost housing that's affordable to low-income people. And it's really critically important that we begin to fight for those resources. The mayor's program, for instance, of 2080 housing, this inclusionary zoning, it's a very good program to bring about integration. It's not a good program to meet the needs of low-income people and to stabilize the loss of low-cost housing that's occurring in our cities. We need new laws to protect tenants. We need new laws to make sure that we stem the speculation that's taking place in our areas. We need to be aggressive around what are the ways we find new monies to invest in our communities so that they benefit all the people that live there.
So Jarrell, you are an organizer and you're out there. Is there a way to buy our way out of this problem? If we backed up a Brinks truck into your office, would you guys just shut down and walk away? Money is here, problem solved?
I think money is, just to answer your question, no. I think money is a huge part of the problem because that gives the landlords incentives, the owners, to harass and push out the tenants. Their goal is to deregulate the apartments and, in a sense, get more money and a higher turnover rate for those apartments. Right. So while money is the basis and the ground of what's causing the problem, I don't think money is going to solve it. I think that people need to be aware and take a collective stand, and the rent laws that protect the tenants that are weakened and are not really doing their job of protecting the tenants, those laws need to be strengthened. So money plays a part in that as well, because I don't know if I should say this, but I know that, you know, people who are making those laws are affected by money as well. But I think that, in a sense, that money is not how we are going to combat it. I think demanding stronger rent laws, being more aware and more active in the fight for stronger rent laws is really what's going to make more of a difference than any amount of money can. Money will help us to organize. Money will pay for more organizers, more facilities, more you know, copies of flyers or whatever, but it won't be an end all to the problem.
So if we were sitting here and this wasn't a town hall, it was Gentrification the musical, who would the bad guy be? We're very good at drawing these lines and we're going to rally against them. We're going to the steps of City Hall to say this is the bad guy, but what face is going to be on the poster?
Surprise.
I hear some suggestions from the audience. Let's hear some from the
surprise
panel.
twist is that we all did it.
Yeah.
I mean, but no, there's a lot of different forces at work, right? You've got the fact that there is this tremendous pressure. I mean, the city and this nation has changed tremendously in the last 30, 40 years. You have a lot more inequality. You have a lot more people with the money to come in and buy people, spend people into the ground. Mm-hmm. At the same time, city policy has changed tremendously. And city policy is, whether you want to be giving it the benefit of the doubt or not, either still fighting the wars of 40 years ago when the goal was how do we get people to want to live here, or is just helping to exacerbate the trend that we're already talking about here in terms of the money and helping the money get done what it wants to do. And it's incredible. I mean, the more I research it, I feel like the more complicated it gets. Yeah. But you have to understand sort of the interaction, right, of those two forces if you're going to in any way try and stop it.
Councilmember Cornegie, you sit on the Housing and Buildings Committee. You are intimately involved in exactly these sorts of things. Is there a way to legislate, or even, as the mayor might be leading us to believe, build our way out of this problem?
No, the first thing we have to do is protect the affordable units that are on the market. That's number one. Because you can't build your way out of this. In a district like mine where there's no more land left, right, you know, that's very difficult to do.
Just as a given, and I'm sorry to jump on that, but you have to legislate your way out of it and make sure that we preserve the affordable housing.
Right, I said you cannot legislate your way out of it. You have to protect the affordable housing units that are here first and foremost. And that's one of the most robust things that we're attempting to do, which is, you know, incentivizing landlords who keep their units affordable. Those units that are in the 15-year program, when they're about to come out, you know, go back to those landlords and re-incentivize them to stay in the program, right? So most of these programs have a shelf life, right? And being proactive as a council in seeking out those individuals who've participated in programs are now, you know, are sunsetting, making sure, find out what their interests are and trying to meet that interest.
Is that
very
job
difficult.
Made easier or harder by a person who's an assembly speaker who allegedly is getting money from the interests working against exactly?
Wow, I wondered how long it would take before Shelley Silver came up in this conversation. So listen, what we've seen even on a city level in elections has been, you know, influx and infusions of capital in an attempt to influence even who the council members are, right? From the Real Estate Board of New York was one of the biggest contributors to campaigns in the city, right? I was almost a victim to that, where there were hundreds of thousands of dollars spent against me in a campaign to have another candidate there. So, you know, there are all kinds of things that we have to look at, not just the affordable unit. We have to look at who are the major players in this process of redeveloping and reshaping the complexion, and not literal complexion, but the complexion of how the city goes forward. And some of us are willing to do that. You know, I didn't get on the Housing and Buildings Committee by accident. That was intentional for me in an effort to be front and center as to what the city is doing as it relates to affordable housing units. So the first thing we have to do is protect the affordable units.
Well, Comptroller Stringer, in his report, they detailed that some 200,000 units have become deregulated over the past 3 decades. Professor Shiffman, is there an instance of someone who's doing it right? Can we look to a city, a municipality, a town, anywhere in the United States even, to be a model?
I don't think we can. I think we really have to do what we used to do in New York City, and that's set the new direction and the new policies that do that. You know, we did that right after World War II when we had a housing crisis. We instituted rent control. We need a new form of rent protection to protect the tenure of people who live in those buildings. We need to go back to the banks. You know, in the 60s and 70s, actually, communities across the country organized to make sure that the banks first forced banks to disclose where they were giving mortgages because of redlining, the discriminatory pattern by which banks lend. Today, I think what we need to do is revisit the Community Reinvestment Act and look at the banks that are now lending to property owners that are displacing people. Because the benefit of CRA is to benefit low-income people and low-income neighborhoods. And if we're going into those neighborhoods, buying those buildings, displacing the tenants who live there that were low-income, then it's no longer meeting that low-income requirement. So we should get the regulators to start looking at the banks that are feeding speculation in many of our neighborhoods. We really need to start looking at how we institute new tax laws to take back for the public coffers to subsidize residents that live there, monies that could be that come from overheated speculation that's taking place. You look at some of the industrial areas now, land prices have gone up threefold since the mayor has announced his rezoning proposals. Why not tax back that benefit so we can use that to provide low-cost housing in the city of New York? We've got to start thinking a little bit more creatively and a little bit more dramatically, because the issue that faces us is not going to go away, and it's not going to be addressed by just minor measures.
So Juan, I think you know a little something about those industrial areas that have tripled in value.
Well, I think Ron is absolutely correct. I think one of the things we also need to do is also get some of these developers that benefit from a lot of these rezonings to do something about it themselves and give back to the community in the same way that they receive from the community. But that also starts at Borough Hall, it starts at City Hall, and it starts with all the elected officials that we elect to represent us, but always end up in rooms, back rooms, dealing these things on their own. I think it needs to be a little bit more transparent in order for the community to be part of the process, because bad rezonings lead to, you know, people being pushed out. And if, for example, you look at the Broadway Triangle, which I chair, the coalition, we were a victim of that, where bad rezoning led to developers now building basically a segregated neighborhood. A neighborhood that is segregated not because these developers don't have the right to build as of right because it's their property, but the bad policies in place allow them to do that. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And that's the problem we need to fix. Part of that also is that we need to be vigilant of some of our city agencies. HPD, for example, is charged with following the Federal Fair Housing Act, which in our case, they admitted on the stand in the court that they didn't follow. And they were supposed to see if that had a desperate impact on the community that it was being developed on.
Okay.
And they admitted not to doing that. So why are we still in a fight over the Broadway Triangle? Why are we not making changes and changing the policies that led to that? Why are we still in these conversations is the question.
Sharon, knowing that there is a fight over the Broadway Triangle and all of those points that he just introduced, I'm gonna ask you to put bifocals on your brain for a minute and take a 40,000 square foot view from above and a street level view to see we're walking in these neighborhoods, we're bumping up against people who we might not recognize from the neighborhood previously, and we may be looking at each other like the enemy, but it's clear that there are some systems in place. And as that young man said, it got a few laughs and some head scratches, but gentrification means I have to live in a neighborhood that I never heard of or maybe even wanted to because I can't afford to live where I think I should live. From a sociological standpoint, that's kind of schizophrenic.
Oh, it's schizophrenic, but a lot of cultural work is done to prepare people to think of dystopic neighborhoods as utopias. In other words, some years ago, the idea of living in the suburbs represented the good life.
You made it.
But yeah, but now living in Fort Greene might be, or Bed-Stuy might be the good life. And you look at the movies, you look at the media, you look at the restaurants, you look at the restaurant reviews, and people are reconstructing the reputations of neighborhoods around cultural goods in a way that the longtime residents can't really share, or they could share to some degree. Everybody likes an orderly neighborhood, clean streets, but not everybody can plunk down $50 for a dinner. So I think that the enemy is us in many ways, even though us may be 5 college students rooming together, but paying together a higher rent than a working class family can pay. Now, I really appreciate the creative thinking that the other panelists have just shown. It's, you know, it's tremendous, but who among us is really going to be vigilant? Who has the time and the energy, the commitment to be so vigilant and to hold elected officials' feet to the fire? Our community boards are just not structured for that. And city governments don't have the resources to build. The federal government is not helping city governments to build public housing anymore. We don't have home rule, so the rent control and rent stabilization laws that are on the books are not really up to us. So there's a lot to target for us.
There's a lot of kicking the can down the road, but what I wanted to say in response was that for some of us, living in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Northern Crown Heights has always been the good life. I just want to clarify that. I mean, if you look at the architecture, which is the same now as it was in 1960, some of us who are long-term residents have a distaste for gentrification based on some of the new comments that we're hearing, just from an anecdotal standpoint. I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you for that point. So how do you know that your neighborhood's being gentrified?
I'll tell you what some of my students at Brooklyn College say. When I walk out on the street and I see a white man jogging Right? That was one thing that a student said, and it might not be fair or typical, but that's one way. Or for example, and this I heard from a student who lives in Bed-Stuy. I walked out the door and I heard people speaking French, and they weren't Haitians. So,
And for some of us long-term residents, when we see white people with a baby in a stroller.
Thai restaurant.
And I think a big result of gentrification that's not being spoken about is the businesses too. I realized how rapidly and how immensely downtown this area was gentrifying when every single mom and pop local business, IHOP, beauty supply store that was there for all my life just all got shut down within a span of like months. They were all gone. And I think that that's a clear indication when local businesses that have been there for years in the community start to all of a sudden shut down one after one after one. Gentrification.
So on that point, as the chair of small business, I do have to say that there's a uniqueness in Bed-Stuy and Northern Crown Heights in the fact that we're still 69% minority owned in terms of our businesses. And one of the things my office has concentrated on, two of the things we've concentrated on through this gentrification is to protect our cultural institutions, which we have a few of, which are great, and they provide programming in and around an African-American culture. And also we build capacity within our small businesses through access to capital and access to technical assistance. Because if you ask any small business what they'd like more of, it's customers. And through gentrification, there are more customers. How do you get them in your doors are conversations that we have. How do you make your stores attractive to a new market is what we have. So there are some people who are seeking, after long-term doing business, seeking ways to capitalize on a new market. That's capitalism 101, is to capitalize on a new and emerging market. So, I got to point out that there are some entities that are looking to benefit from a changing demographic.
Those businesses are very fortunate to have that option, but a lot do not. A lot get bought out and don't even have the option or the choice. And that's, that's the reality of what gentrification is. If you can stay, that's good. But a lot of people are not given that option. Businesses and people and tenants, they're not given the choice or the matter to stay. They're being bought out and forced out. And I think that's the main problem here.
One of the pieces of legislation that I've just authored is a piece of legislation which calls on business owners to be subsidized, just the same way we do the rent subsidies for seniors and for disabled. We have a piece of legislation in now that would incentivize building owners to keep affordable rents for small businesses that have proven themselves within the district. And we wrote a resolution and actually helped author the state legislation that the resolution supports. So we're hoping in this session that's something that will get some attention and be able to provide for those businesses who are not able to provide for themselves or don't have a bid or don't have a merchants association and are able to do that.
So Neil, as we talk about these ripple effects of this thing that we're sort of naming now, you've been out on the streets collecting these stories. The book is coming. It's been 10 years worth of work. What are the stories that you're hearing?
I mean, everything that people are talking about here, really. I was just last week talking to someone in Bushwick who's been there, I think, 15, 20 years, long-time residents, and she said she can't find anyone to rent to her because she has kids, and this is something that, hadn't occurred to me as someone who's not going through that, but just the fact that you've got these massive numbers of young people who are willing to live 4 to an apartment, right? And the landlords can say, hey, we just don't want to deal with kids. We'd rather have 4 wage earners coming in there, and they definitely could be able to pay $3,000 a month rent. And it's a huge crisis. The number of different iterations of this are tremendous.
Is that Bushwick or Northern Williamsburg?
Bushwick. Not the industrial park. This is Bushwick.
So if we're talking about this gets to the heart of one of the most important questions that we don't often get a chance to hear voiced. Is number one, the feminization of poverty. With a woman with children not being able to find an affordable, viable apartment for her family.
It's a couple, by the way, and they're working, so it's not even that they don't have money.
Okay, and to further expand then, is gentrification now a civil rights issue?
Absolutely.
Totally.
Yes.
For our people who are listening on radio, they nodded their heads, yes.
No, I said absolutely.
Absolutely. So unpack that for us. Is gentrification, we've been deeply involved in civil rights. We've had 2 town halls here, but it doesn't immediately come to mind for lots of people that the very act of gentrification or being in a place could be a civil rights issue.
Well, I like what Mr. Shiffman said earlier, which is that it's the way that gentrification acts in communities like ours. That's the problem. And it's what comes along with gentrification and all of those displacement and those kinds of things, you know, are really, really a problem. And if you look at it closely, and some of the greatest minds are now looking at it saying it absolutely is, or can be denoted as a civil rights issue. So I would have to agree there with that.
Yeah, I would like to second that as well. Being an organizer on the ground and really experiencing right along with my tenant leaders, which are the members of the Flatbush Tenant Coalition, we call them leaders, and just seeing the conditions that they have to live in and the harassment that they're subjected to, everything that the landlords and their owners of the buildings do to get them out of these apartments, it definitely hands down becomes a civil rights issue because their rights as human beings are being infringed upon. Their children are being affected. You know, just a little story about one of our buildings on Newkirk Avenue. They want to take criminal charges up against a lawsuit up against their landlord because their children were rushed to the hospital because for the umpteenth time the ceiling had collapsed on top of them. And this is something that happens, it's a normal thing, unfortunately, and because these landlords have so much incentive to deregulate the apartments that they're just doing whatever it takes to get these people out. And these are their homes that they've lived in for years, for decades, for centuries, and they're just being forced out just so that they can deregulate the apartments and new people can come in and be overcharged. So it definitely becomes a civil rights issue, the impacts, the effect that gentrification has on these neighborhoods.
So where's the enforcement? There was an interesting article in the New York Times the other day about housing court in Brooklyn and how dysfunctional that court is. Where's the enforcement? Where is the will? Where's the political will to enforce even the laws that are on the books?
Yeah.
Well, as long as the laws are on the books, we know that we're 5 minutes away from June 15th when the current rent rules are set to expire. Where is the heat now to get those things strengthened or even at the very least preserved? Well, you've got the heat, I imagine.
Yeah, it's right here, right in Flatbush and in Crown Heights, and where the organizing groups around the city are definitely coming together. And we had a housing justice march. There were some marches in the Bronx. Like, people are trying to get the word out, but I think that the only way that it can be more of a mass collective effort is if everyone joins in. Like, if everyone in this room were like, we're gonna go march in the streets or maybe on the sidewalk or however you want to do it so we don't get arrested. I think that's what needs to happen. People need to take action and come together. It's not just me as an organizer. Like, even when my job as an organizer is finished, I'm still a Brooklyn tenant. I still come home and live in Brooklyn, so it's never over. And just a point that was made that I disagree with, that like it got kind of like it left that point, was saying like who would be the enemy in the musical. I think it would be the system that allows for this to happen, because the people, I would never say that I'm the enemy or I'm the villain, because I'm the victim. You know, as an organizer and someone who've lived in Brooklyn all my life, like, I didn't ask for this to happen. I didn't ask for the neighborhood to gentrify. So I feel it's a little unfair to blame the people and say it's us, because we didn't allow the systems to be like this. We didn't allow the laws to be weakened. We could have probably took a more stance against it, but I would definitely disagree and say the system as a larger entity would be the enemy, would be the villain that we're up against, because it's what we're fighting and it's what's causing this to happen and what's allowing this to happen. Okay. If the rent laws were stronger, then this wouldn't be an issue.
And I just want to add to that I think we also need to begin the process by which people will elect the people that sit on these boards that are responsible for, you know, pushing these things on us, instead of being appointed by some elected officials who have obviously their own purpose for putting such people on those boards. Because that's one of the problems too. People can show up all they want. We've rallied and rallied all we've wanted. But at the end of the day, is those elected officials and those people with the interests that sit in those rooms making those decisions, you know, that they come back and smile at us and say, we tried our best for you.
What's the roadmap for that, Professor?
I do think, you know, we're at a moment in time because of the silver scandal where we really need to talk about the way the state operates vis-a-vis the city. And to have the state making decisions over a local issue like rent and community is just an outrage. We should be able to point to our council members and say, you're responsible, but they're not. They can't do that. I think we need to use this opportunity to demand from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party statewide that we finally get a state legislature that's accountable to its people in the various different communities, and that the city of New York begin to exercise some of its own local powers over local issues. And I think it's critically important that we begin to open up that debate, because if we don't, we're going to constantly be under the thumb of the state that will be more beholden to real estate industry than it will be to the people in the city of New York. It really is important that we begin to figure out ways of breaking down both the state and the federal government to join the city in addressing these issues. But the city can't just absolve itself of responsibility. We need to do things. The council members' initiative around small business is really important. We need to force businesses, primarily property owners, to not allow for rapid increases in rents, seeing rents on commercial strips going up 2 to 3 times when it comes up for renewal. Why not force them into arbitration or something of that nature? Let's begin to look at what tools we have locally, what tools we need to get from the state, and really begin to develop both a coalition that brings together all of the parties in the city of New York to begin to demand those changes, because otherwise we're just talking. We really need to begin to do something that leads to action.
Councilmember?
I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, you know, in my district is Community Board 3. And if anybody here has been to Community Board 3 meetings, there are 200-300 people at every meeting. And they have a rather robust committee assignments. You asked earlier, what does gentrification look like? So in Bedford-Stuyvesant, it looks like a slew of bar openings on every block and every corner. Well, let me just tell you something. Community Board 3 is on top of that, and has decided that they won't allow, within reason, for the complexion of the community and the nightlife to be changed in such a way that it benefits a new demographic and doesn't benefit the existing demographic. So there are mechanisms in place that you can have a say-so in what happens, right? And I'm not pushing this off. I was a community board member and co-chaired Health and Human Services before I ever became a council member, because I wanted to get involved at whatever level I could get involved before government. So there are many people who've chosen to do that in their communities of choosing. I gotta suggest that you go back to those entities and those structures that are set up to help you deal with some of the things, right? So we know that this elephant in the room, which is housing, is a huge element. Right? And, you know, they tell me, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? Not that I advocate for the eating of any animals. Let's be clear, especially elephants, or horses, for that matter. But there are some systems that are in place that seem to be able to give the residents of their respective communities a voice. And I just wanted to say that community boards, when organized correctly and with the correct leadership, provide that.
I feel like it's a huge issue because, like, you know, lots of people here are doing fantastic work. Community boards are doing good work. You know, this has been going on for as long as I've been alive in New York City. And at the same time, you know, our voices are not necessarily the ones that are getting heard the most, right? You know, I mean, the Real Estate Board of New York is always going to get heard more than anyone sitting here in this panel. You know, the New York Times, as much as it does great work covering issues of poverty and housing and all this other stuff, the voices of the gentrifiers, you know, the issues of the gentrifiers are always going to be heard more in the New York Times than, you know, the issues of the gentrified. And I guess my question for the panel is, what is it going to take to get, you know, these voices heard and these concerns heard? What is necessary for the system, right, that is not set up to do this, to actually be forced to or to care to, you know, hear this and say this is something that we have to act on because, you know, it's a crisis. It's not just business as usual.
I want to follow up on what Neil just said. It's crucial for community voices to be heard, but it's also crucial for more powerful voices to ally themselves with the communities. And the New York Times was at the top of my mental list. It's really difficult, I'd say it's impossible, to get any view published in the Times, as an op-ed piece, for example, that argues in favor of rent control. I remember a number of years ago, I submitted an op-ed piece to municipalize Con Ed or something like that. Yeah, that went over like a lead balloon. But the Times does have a very influential voice. Maybe there's some way for the public architecture critic, Michael Kimmelman, or somebody to say more about what's happening in communities in terms of conversions of property. Maybe it's time for the Municipal Art Society, which has had a very active community supporting. Had, okay. Even in Flatbush, they had something, right? You know, some kind of program. They've done great things. They've had quite a lot of influence on certain kinds of development in New York City. Why don't they lend their voice to community voices? So, you know, maybe we have to find some cracks in the power structure.
I think the New City Club, which came out of the fact that MAS moved away from being engaged and it reinvigorated the City Club, might be the kind of ally that will do that. And I think, at least talking to some of them, they're taking on the issue. So I think you're on the right track. I think we really need to build those alliances.
So, have we agreed, though, that some of this is driven by, so I know as a city government, we're responsible for being a stopgate for some of the overdevelopment and but there are real estate speculators who have inflated home prices, who have done things in the short term to make a lot of money,
many
and
of
are going
whom
to leave
don't
us in the
even
wake.
live in this country.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you know, if anybody was on trial here, it would be the whole capitalist system that really, and again, I really want to sit intently and get an idea on what I can do to be a better council person in all of this. So I don't want to get into vilifying people, but I'm kind of clear, you know, where some of this originated from. Because when I look at speculators, speculators have already, to some degree, left Bedford-Stuyvesant, because when the brownstone's worth 1.8, they can't be there anymore. So they're already in East New York and Brownsville. So we know where they're going almost. Like we can kind of chart their territory and try to cut off what we've seen happen in Fort Greene, Clinton Hills, Bed-Stuy. Like it's this clear path, swath that's been cut out of central Brooklyn. So, you know, we really have to look at where this is driven and how much money is actually made in this. So we're unfortunately in this reactionary position, which really doesn't serve the city and my constituency or the constituency of the city very well.
Well, let's talk about that acceleration. Professor Zukin, as an urban sociologist, I read something that you wrote about the fact that this seems like a process on steroids, where in planning for this, we thought, oh, gentrification as a natural process. Maybe an immigrant family who lived on the Lower East Side really pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and made it to the suburbs. So they left all these spaces that became occupied by other people trying to climb their way up the ladder. But now that was gentrification, and now we see it as...
No, that's not gentrification, that's upward social mobility.
Upward social mobility is different than gentrification.
It's different. You know, those of us with longer histories and longer memories remember the earlier periods of disinvestment. And, you know, in a way, we really are tied to the ebb and flow of capital, right? I mean, we're all living in the same system. So the disinvestment, the disinvested areas of some years ago become attractive once again when investors, capitalists, developers, speculators, foreign investors in real estate trusts, when they're looking to park their money somewhere. They say, oh, it's not so expensive to invest over there. Okay. So, you know, I'm not trying to be a fatalist about this at all, but I am trying to say that there's an individual view and even a group view. Sometimes groups experience upward social mobility together. Right. But we also are contending with these movements of big amounts of capital investment and even medium amounts of capital investment that find the soft spots in the property system. And somehow we have to be in control, or try to be in control of all of these processes. But, you know, people do talk about ethnic succession, for example. Yeah. Oh, one ethnic group moves in, and then a lot of their members do well, they move out. Right. And then the next ethnic group comes in, so on and so forth. But now we're in such a tight competition for space that there's no smooth passage out of our city. So it's we're really fighting over what's here.
Well, speaking of that fight, earlier we all alluded to the fact that in one instance you might be the gentrifier one day, and 6 months later when lease renewal time comes, you might be the gentrified. So in asking what can we do as neighbors to humanize this issue and not look at the person who moved in as the enemy, if we're gonna dismantle a system and these mechanisms, how can we begin to build coalitions? But as you guys think about your succinct answers to that question, I'm gonna let you know that in about 10 minutes, we're gonna open up to questions so we can put the town in the town hall. So for the next hour, we'll have an exchange between these smart people and you smart people. So if you do have a question, please make your way to the sides, to the microphones, and then we're gonna get into those questions. So how do we start to see friends and neighbors as friends and neighbors, even if we're just meeting them?
Well, I think that directly relates to the work that I do. I'll go inside a building in our catchment area, Flatbush area, and I'll just talk to people, and you'll realize that the problems that the older Caribbean or minority tenants are experiencing are the same problems that the newer, white tenants are experiencing, or the newer other ethnicities are experiencing. And once we found that common ground, there was less of a looking at each other as enemies. They realize you're all tenants in the same building and all neighbors. So once you take a collective stand, it's way easier for us to put pressure on their owner that they both share. They both have the same landlord, to put pressure to do the repairs, to stop the harassment. We get more information about the building to find out if they're slowly, illegally deregulating the apartments within the building. So I think the first step for just everyday people on the ground is to just don't look at, the new people coming in as your enemy, because they're going to be subject to the same problems you are. They're most likely being overcharged. Whatever repair issues you're having in the building and whatever harassment you're having, they most likely will have that same problem. Because the landlord, the developers, they're not looking at it like we want white people in the neighborhood. They're looking at it like we want money, and we want to exploit everyone we can to get more money. So, it's like you just come together, make a collective stand against the problem, and that's where you can start.
I see you, Neil.
I think I agree with you, and I don't agree with you. I think you're right that they want money, and that's the bottom line. I think, one of the things we're dancing around here is the issue of race, and I think wanting white people is all about wanting money, I mean, you see it in neighborhood after neighborhood, right? There's like this succession pattern of waves of people. First, you have the folks who move there when nobody else wanted to live there, right? Which is usually people of color and immigrants. Yeah. Then you have the artists, right? The folks who will live anywhere as long as it's cheap, and they're perfectly fine living with people who, in a neighborhood with people who may not look like them. And then you have the people who say, hey, wow, that neighborhood's really cool. There's a bunch of white artists there. I feel comfortable there, you know, the sort of, and then come the people who say, oh, wow, look, you know, I feel totally fine. You know, that's not a, you know, neighborhood of color or dangerous or something like that. That's someplace where I'm going to see a lot of people who look like me. And each stage, right? So I feel like the first step is for potential gentrifiers, which is all of those people except for the first one, is to be aware of where you are in the process, right? And to say, okay, you know, it's something I face, right? You know, I'm sort of a middle-class white person living in Brooklyn. I have been pushed out of neighborhoods, and I have gone into other neighborhoods and probably rented apartments that other people then couldn't afford because I was paying more. Right. And you have to be aware of it, and you have to be willing to say, okay, what can, you know, how can we sort of all work together on this? But it's hard, you know?
Yeah, I would agree to disagree, because I think that that may be how it originally appeared, like, and that may be how it was at one point in time, but the lines are getting skewed. Like, as the councilman said, he's, you know, a black man who became successful, came back into his neighborhood, and now he's the gentrifier. So I think that the lines are getting skewed because, number one, it's happening so rapidly, gentrification, and you don't know who's walking around anymore. You can't look at a neighborhood and say that's a typically black neighborhood anymore. You just can't do that because the lines are becoming so skewed and it's becoming so gentrified so rapidly that neighborhoods that were predominantly white and black is like, it's just like a melting pot of mix now. It just doesn't look the same anymore.
But what I would argue is that if he grew up in that neighborhood and now he comes back and stays, he's not a gentrifier. He's a product of a policy that we should be pursuing. And I think that one of the big antidotes to gentrification is if we really invest in our communities so that they grow socially and economically and politically and powerfully. Yeah. We really have to begin to do that rather than have a strategy that says the city renews itself by replacing the people who are there. How do we develop the programs? I'm not arguing with you, I'm just building on what you're saying. How do we build the programs that allow them to develop to the point where they are the next middle-income population so that people aren't trapped in poverty, but you can actually grow a community so that it can grow economically and politically?
I think in order to build coalitions that may work in that way, you also need those that are considered gentrifiers coming in to really study the neighborhood, understand where they're moving into, because sometimes what happens is that the culture there suffers, right? And I'll give you an example, Graham Avenue in Williamsburg, where many of the businesses Latino owned. Over the summer we had a whole big movement trying to preserve these two record shops who made their business by, you know, having their music playing from their storefront. All of a sudden, gentrifiers are moving in, and they're 311, and now all of a sudden they can't play their music, which has led to some of them closing. Yeah. So we have, you know, and to his credit, you know, I want to give the councilman credit for building those type of things to really look at protecting businesses that are there and have been there. Because some of these businesses, for example, one that I worked with over the summer, been there 40-something years. Yeah. And all of a sudden he's looking at the possibility of having to close down. That is not right. And it's not right because the person across the street who's calling 301 100 times a day is there because she's, you know, painting her collage or whatever she's doing, and it's bothering her, and you know, now this man has to suffer. So I think in order to build those coalition, there needs to be a level of respect for the community you're moving into, and understanding that there's culture there.
So, confessions of a black gentrifier. I happen to be a person who grew up in Chicago. I'm one of your constituents now, of course. I'm in Bed-Stuy. And, you know, I don't consider myself a gentrifier because I grew up in a neighborhood that's like Bed-Stuy. So where do you come in on that scale then? You're the favorite son who came back, but you're still the gentrifier. Give us your capsule.
Well, so speaking of favorite sons that come back, I'm in a district where my children won't be able to come back. Once they graduate.
Doesn't that depend on you too?
No, I'm saying if things continue the way they are, right, it won't be. So I'm very concerned about that. But and just to your point, we have people calling the office saying that the mosque is too loud. Can you make them stop praying on Friday? And the church bells on Sunday. I live in the borough of churches, and if Brooklyn is the borough of churches, then Bed-Stuy certainly is the epicenter of churches. So there is no shortage of bell ringing and prayer, which has been an integral part of the survival of that community. And we get a consistent barrage of calls asking to make that stop. Now, what I understand is this is secular. And some of this would have happened anyway, except it's exacerbated by the tragedy in Lower Manhattan and the towers falling, right? So we had a flood of people come into the borough, and everything shifted quicker than it normally would have. So it really turned the entire Brooklyn on its axis, right? So we understand that. Now, how we right that ship is something that, as first and foremost, as a citizen, I'm trying to do. But now with legislative and policy powers, and with collaboration with my state and federal government, we're trying to make sure that we can slow some of it down. But you should know that there are people that are invested in making sure that the sanctity of our communities, which are the life's bread of New York City, remain the same.
So we're going to go to our questions in just a moment, so please get that question ready and tight. But I'm going to do the most unfair thing of the night and ask you to give us your 40-second overview of ethical gentrification.
Of what?
Ethical gentrification.
Ethical gentrification.
How do you do it ethically? How can this process happen?
There ain't no such thing.
All right, I'm going to cede those 45 seconds to you, ma'am. If you would share your name and neighborhood and really keep it tight so we can get moving.
My name is Alicia Boyd, and I represent Flatbush, Crown Heights, Prospect Lefferts Gardens. I'm the black side of the park.
Okay, the black side of the park.
We all know that side, don't we?
We see where this is going. Get to your question.
Yeah, and I represent a grassroots movement called MTOP, the Movement to Protect the People. And we have been in a serious rezoning fight with city planning. And the whole idea is to rezone our community to allow luxury developments underneath the so-called provide affordable housing.
So what's the question?
So the question is how does a community supposed to, from the ground up, control what happens to them and their direction if the policies that are in place by the mayor's office and city planning tells a community if you do not upzone a particular boulevard, in this case Empire Boulevard, we will not rezone you.
Okay, Juan, this is happening with you on Broadway right now.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that we found out during the litigation was the fact that HPD, who was charged with, having to see what kind of an impact racially this would have in the community, that they totally dismissed the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was one of the things that led to the judge giving a favorable outcome for us in the litigation. Now, I would say be vigilant of that, but also that we need to continue to organize, because if we just wait on our electeds, it's not gonna, I mean, in our situation, Bed-Stuy and Williamsburg together, over 40 organizations came together and formed this coalition, which I chair, and we were failed at every single step of the way. We were failed at the community board. We were failed when we went to Borough Hall. We were failed in the city council, and ultimately the mayor's office allowed it to happen. And I think that people have to continue to fight in order to show that we're not going to take it anymore, but also allying ourselves with those electeds who would stand up with us and say no more. Because while we were at city council asking them to favorably vote on our behalf, we were told that council members usually vote with the council member from that district even if they don't like the plan. So that's a problem. But we had 10, for the first time we heard in history, for the first time 10 council members stood up against the council member from the district and said, no, there's something wrong with this project and we don't like it. And we need more elected officials to stand up and say they're not going to tolerate it anymore, that politics as usual, business as usual is hurting people, and that we're going to stop that. So I think part of that has to be a constant. And again, someone recently told me that morality doesn't fit in business. But if we lose, our direction in that moral compass, then we give up everything. So we're the ones that got to keep up the fight, because for us it is a matter of survival in our communities that some people never wanted to live in, and now all of a sudden they find, you know, that it's the hippest place on earth, like they say in Williamsburg.
So is that morality and a federal lawsuit, Professor?
Well, it's not the morality, it's the practicality. I don't understand why city planning refuses to allow this community, the Broadway Triangle, to fight for higher density zoning and pushes it on your community. Right. And it gets back to the need. Different places have different sort of genetic makeup in the quality of their neighborhood. Your neighborhood has historically been a low-rise community. It's covenanted, not discriminatory, but just to keep it 1- and 2-family houses. It seems to me that we should get back to what Scott Stringer was talking about. How do we really develop community-based and community-initiated planning rather than see it come down from the top? And if communities each had a mandate, we want you to find affordable housing, we want you to meet this following moral and ethical principles, but you come up with the solutions, communities would do it. Believe me, they would do it. And in the Broadway Triangle, they would do it in a different way than they would in Lefferts Gardens. And I think, and in Prospect Heights. And it seems to me that we need to fight, and this is something we can do, on more of an initiative by the city to respect local community-initiated plans and to allow the planning process to come from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
Okay, we're going to take it over to this side. Share your name and neighborhood and your question.
Greetings, my name is A.M. Goodrich, and I also represent Crown Heights, but I also, as a former member of Occupy Brooklyn, still a member of Occupy Wall Street, and also a part called the Crown Heights Tenant Union, including bloggers like Brownstoner and Sheepshead Bites. And I've been through like a lot of gentrification business, not just here in the Central Park, but also Southern Brooklyn. Talk about Sheepshead Bay, Brighton Beach, and Coney Island. Could be the next risk taker of being gentrified. And we've been over and over again fed up with the anti-development and like overdevelopment problem that they play Southern Brooklyn for 10 years.
Is there a particular question for those neighborhoods?
My question is, how does Sheepshead Bay, Brighton Beach, and Coney Island be effectively gentrified and like in case when Brighton Beach being withdrawn from being upzoned?
I know that you've done a lot of work on coastal Brooklyn, as we call it now, particularly post-Sandy, and you've done some pioneering thought on gentrification post the storm. Let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, Coney Island just went through a bitter battle over a rezoning plan that was allegedly to benefit people who are living there, but I think, you know, is turning out to be pushing out businesses and turning out to be, you know, bringing in new residents, not necessarily benefiting the folks who are there. Yeah. You know, and in Brighton, I feel like you're seeing just an influx of people. You're seeing both the sort of more natural, if you want to call it that, gentrification and the unnatural city-sponsored gentrification going on. I think that one thing that could have gone on in Coney Island and in that whole area is more organizing across different communities. You know, I don't think you ever really saw the folks living down at the west end of Coney Island and the folks in the amusement district and the folks in Brighton who are fighting this all getting together and saying, okay, this is something that affects all of us. Just because, you know, it's hard and coalition building is difficult, but I think that's sort of the next step is, you know, it's interesting having people from different neighborhoods here on this panel talking about that and sort of saying, okay, how can we, you know, organize citywide and, you know, as opposed to just fighting battle by battle by battle.
So Professor Shiffman, is there a way to build better, smarter, greener, and more affordably in Coney Island than those people who are so impacted by this storm?
Well, I think Coney Island and the Rockaways and places like that, we really have to build a lot smarter, and in many cases that may be not to build at all. Because unfortunately, some of those people who will live there will be in harm's way, not maybe tomorrow, but definitely in 10 or 15 years, definitely by the end of the century. And so what really bothers me with some of the initiatives the city is taking, one in the Rockaways, is they're ready to build upper income housing right near where public housing may very well have to sacrifice their first floors. And they'll see this luxury housing being built next door to them and say, you're giving us a song by telling us we have to vacate our first 2 floors in public housing. But if we don't vacate those 2 floors and we don't build smart in the Rockaways, those people's lives are in jeopardy. So I really am very torn by the desire to see places to build, the desire to retain low-income housing, and the desperate need, I think, for us to adapt how we build in those areas so we build safely, not only for today, but for the day after tomorrow.
Okay. Yeah, please, just your name and your neighborhood.
Good evening, Joe Gonzalez, Bedford-Stuyvesant. I direct my question to Professor Shiffman. Business improvement districts. And what do you believe their role in gentrification is? And more specifically, do you believe it's time to just end the bids that the city has put into place in recent years?
My short answer is yes. I think business improvement districts lead to the discrimination of one district versus the other. I originally was supportive of them, but what I've seen is that they help richer communities become richer and poorer communities really are left behind. I think some real reforms are needed in the business improvement districts, basically involving tenants in the decisions, and by that I mean both residential and business tenants. Because when the bid is run primarily by those who own the buildings, then it doesn't lead to the stability of that area, nor to its cultural retention and its meaning to neighborhoods. So I'm very concerned about business improvement districts. I'm very concerned about people who would like to adopt that for residential areas. I don't like it being done for parks because we're winding up with a dual system in the city of New York. On the other hand, I'm a realist enough to know that you need to generate money in some cases, and particularly in our present situation. So sometimes you need to create those kinds of partnerships and programs, but you have to be very, very careful because in the end they come back to bite you.
So just so you know, we were concerned at the City Council about bids and just had an oversight hearings, specifically unprecedented directly on bids, and looked at tenant to ownership parity in terms of their voice in the development. Yeah. So we're right on par, kind of, I think, with what you're saying.
So what did you find? Give us a preview.
Well, we found that there were some egregious behavior that left out the voice in some districts, that left out the voice of the tenant as far as development was concerned. We found that in some districts there was some charges that shouldn't have existed. So we're looking at reforms within bids, but the program overall in some communities has worked well, where there's been no organization between on commercial districts. Yeah. So we don't want to, as they say down south, throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, Professor Zukin, how does this fit into the sort of Jane Jacobs dream of having the candle maker next to the butcher, next to the doctor, all of these people mixing and living and being cooperative together? Is that a formula that works in the city when her house just sold for $11 million?
Jane Jacobs was not envisioning the Duane Reade next to the yoga studio next to the HSBC branch. No, back to business improvement districts, as Ron Shiffman suggested, this is a model that has been exported around the world, and it has a lot of appeal to city governments because the business improvement districts fund themselves. But all around the world, the bids often give much more power to the commercial building owners than to the stores that are their tenants, and much more power to the big stores and the chain stores, which often don't even want to get involved in the bids, and their managers don't even have the authority to get involved in bids. So yeah, I think that they're a very interesting organization, but they have to be maybe re-examined and reconstructed.
Gotcha. We're back here.
Jenny Dubnow here, representing Jackson Heights, Queens, and the Artist Studio Affordability Project. Talking about commercial rents is a huge crisis, as we all know, which affects mom and pop stores and artists and helps to displace people in communities, and it goes hand in hand with residential displacement. And I wanted to ask all of you guys, specifically Councilmember Carnegie, what you think about a bill that's in the City Council now that I think Ron Shiffman alluded to, called the Small Business Job Survival Act, which would force commercial leases to arbitration and guarantee a 10-year lease, which could be a lifesaver for artists and small businesses and could also help slow displacement residentially in so many of our communities.
Is it going to happen?
I was on the phone today with Mr. Hull for an hour from the Small Business Congress discussing that bill, and I promised him that tomorrow we would look at it in its entirety and get right back and actually have a meeting with him and the Small Business Congress to examine it, its merits, and to look at the piece of legislation that we have in partnership with the state and see if there's any ways we can confine it to one bill. But we are absolutely aware of it and understand its value.
Great. Artists don't want to be gentrifiers.
Understood.
Thank you. Step up.
But they are gentrifiers. I want to say that my name is Orville Nelson. I'm from a cusp of Crown Heights, East New York.
We get it. Just share your question really quickly. There's a lot of people in the aisle.
You asked,
Please.
Now, I will say that as a black man in Brooklyn, I know that there's a thing called segregation. And since that is in place thoroughly in New York State, when we talk about gentrification and we would like to talk about race, I think if you don't talk about that, I think that's very bad. It doesn't make any sense.
Thank you.
And I also want to talk about, mention stop and frisk, how it impacts people who live in a particular community and keeps them down.
Where were you last time? We did 2 town halls. Please, let's get right to the question.
I'm at the question. Give me a moment, please. What I'm saying is gentrification is colonialism in terms of people of color communities. And when if we're not going to be honest here, what is the price of gentrification? That's why I came. I wanted to know what that meant. Okay. And when I was in college, give me one moment, I'm going to leave right now.
You got 30 seconds.
Yeah, when I was in college, we talked about the fact that it takes a white community a certain period of time to form, like 15 to 20 years.
Gotcha.
And a black community or Latino community significantly longer. So when you have a community just starting to get on its feet and coalesce, and drugs have been introduced, like this, all that stuff, and then you have white people coming in talking about it's our turn to, that's ridiculous. And I really think if we want to be honest and we really want to get somewhere with gentrification, with race in this country, with race in Brooklyn, we really have to come at it totally different, because all this I hear is not really real. But
thank you. Right to you, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Sharona Victoria. I would like to know, for the original homeowners that are left in these neighborhoods, how do we go about making them understand the value of real estate instead of just taking the money and running down south? I also want you to know that I grew up also in Crown Heights. My home that I grew up in sold for $1.5 million through a very popular real estate company here in New York City.
Yeah.
And Christmas, I was invited to someone's home and was absolutely horrified when I saw the brownstone a few blocks away from where I grew up turned into a brownstone SRO.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Is there even a question about the value and people not knowing what they have?
So we talk about that all the time, right? Because what hasn't been spoken about, in my district, there's always been a tale of 2 bed-stuys. Yeah. Just so we know.
Only
there's
2.
At least 2 bed-stuys. One in which people have owned their property for decades and have summer homes in Sag Harbor.
Yeah.
And one north of that, where people live in abstract poverty, right? So some people have said, when we were trying to create affordable housing, I had a meeting with with HPD.
Yeah.
And since we don't have any more land to build on, their suggestion to me was to contact some 1 to 4 unit owners, brownstone owners, who are willing to have their units incentivized so that they could rent them at a lower rate. And when I talked to some of my homeowners, they were like, absolutely not. When we've invested so much, they would like to see a return on their investment as well. Why should they not be able to benefit from the long-term home ownership and the perils of the 80s and things like that they benefited from?
Does that mean they wanted to cash out and go down south?
No, that means that they want
more
market value for the units that they own.
As owner
As
places.
Owners
As
renting
owners
out units in their
As
home.
landlords, yes.
As landlords.
Right. There's two narratives out there. There's a narrative that says that people are being priced out of a community that they have been invested in forever. And then there's another narrative that says homeowners who've stayed during very tumultuous times.
Want to reap the rewards.
And would like to, I won't even say reap the rewards. I would say like anybody else in a business language would say I'd like a return on my investment.
It's a huge problem that everyone who owns property in the city is simultaneously a member of a community and also a speculator on their own property.
Yeah, I mean, when we said before that gentrifiers are us to some degree, this is one dimension of that problem. I mean, there are those who have invested in property and those who have not had the means to do so. And their interests are, in many ways, not the same.
But there has to also be a difference between someone who is looking to seek a fair return and someone who's simply parasitic.
Absolutely. And I think people that are long-term owners are not parasitic. And they're looking at, and their units traditionally rent under market value. Right. Because they understand the struggle that they took to maintain their homes. Yeah. But asking someone to do that, not of their own volition, reeks of something else. And people don't want to be taken advantage of on either end.
All right, I'm going to ask you to step up, please.
Yeah, hi. My name is Duran Jackson. I'm a visual artist. I live in Bed-Stuy. And I'm very curious to know what is being done, what's being done to retain culture in our neighborhood, like really retain culture. I think one of the biggest problems I think that I've experienced is how artists are used to, I don't know, attract and to market an area. And as soon as it's up and running and it's at full tilt, artists are moved out. I experienced this from the early 90s. I lived in Fort Greene, Clinton Hill. Yep. It's popping. Moved to Bed-Stuy. I went away for a year for a fellowship. I came back and someone mentioned development on steroids. It's on steroids and it's aggressive. I want to know, how do we retain the cultural integrity and the importance of culture and the importance of artists?
Professor Zukin.
Sorry?
I think it's very clear. You're getting the claps. They know where you're going. I want to ask the professor has a term for this. Artistic mode of production. Unpack that for us.
Yes. Well, let me reserve that for just a minute because that's a little different. Artists are often renters, and they're in the same situation as other renters. So, if there were some legal form for cooperative housing to be built for artists, by artists, with artists, that would be great. That would be a way of staying.
Well, I completely agree with you. I think that if artists don't get in the quote-unquote game, then we're going to continue to be pushed out of our communities that we really create. But I wanted to ask my councilman, is there anything in place that, or is there any thought being given to, helping or assisting artists to become a player in the game?
Absolutely. So my short answer is, my ambassador of arts and culture is right there. He's going to raise his hand, and I'd like for you to talk to him after. But the long but short answer is, we are discussing artist colonies because we understand the vitality of protecting culture. I think that's one of the first things I said. Well, there are two ways that we realized in the face of gentrification that we were going to be aggressive. And one was to protect our arts and culture, and the other was to build capacity within our small businesses. And we do both of those things relatively decently. So I'd like for you to partner with my ambassador to arts and culture, because between Von King and Weeksville Heritage Center and Restoration, programming is going on. What we found is that our local artists are not prepared to accept even the stipends available for everything from murals to sculptures to all. So I want you to partner and talk to him, because we'd like to cultivate
We're going
homegrown
to try to get
artists.
to as many questions as possible.
Okay,
but honestly, just one more thing.
I'm sorry, we really have to go on. And we'll be here all night. I promise you.
But Bed-Stuy is the largest Black artist community in the city.
Thank you.
The largest artist community in the city.
Thank you.
Yes, hello. My name is Kim Gardner, and I live in a building that's being gentrified as I speak. The landlord suggested that we move to Florida, and he's actually doing renovations over our heads. My question is, how do we help ourselves? We really don't know. We're at a loss. We've been there for 13 years or more, most of the tenants. So what does a tenant, and we're in a crisis situation, we are being immediately displaced. So what do we do now?
Who is she supposed to email tonight, Jarrell?
Well, I think that one thing that you can do is to talk to your neighbors, talk to the other tenants in the building, and form a collective group, form a tenant association within your building, so you guys can come together and speak about the issues, and don't disclude the new tenants that's coming in. You know, there was a lot of talk about segregation, and segregation is very real in terms of race and class, and segregation between renters and homeowners. But that's kind of how, like, they win. That's kind of how we lose, is when we allow that segregation to come between us. So I think the first step is to form a tenant association in your building. Where do you live?
I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant. It's a small brownstone, actually,
Bed-Stuy.
building, and most of the tenants are Black.
Okay, so I think that you guys should come together in your building, form a tenant association, reach out to any organization. I'm not sure if the council member...
My chief of staff is here. She's going to give you her card.
Right, so you have the information for any organization or housing group in your area that could assist and grow your tenant association to fight back. There are lots of laws that are in place for tenants who are long-term that they're going to be weakened or they're going to expire in June, but they are in place at the moment. And from how long you've been there, 13 years, you might be rent stabilized, which gives you lots of protections as a tenant. And when you learn more about rent stabilization and what protections you have, you'll be able to utilize those resources and those protections so that you can kind of combat what's happening. But the first step is to come together with your neighbors. There's power in numbers, and I can't state enough to just come together collectively. Don't allow segregation to win. Don't allow segregation to be a tool for them to win, basically.
But if you're in a 1 to 3 or 1 to 4, there are different rules that apply. So please talk to my office.
Okay. Right. That's why I say reach out to any organization that's in your area so that they can find out exactly what protections apply to you, and you can use those resources and tools to fight what's happening.
We're closing in on our last 25 minutes. Let's tighten it up.
I wonder if the panel could address increasing income inequality as a driver of gentrification. And if you want to take that a step further, the way increasing income inequality is leading to increasing political inequality, and that's leading to a sort of a vicious cycle with public assets being seized and privatized.
Thank you.
Well, you know, what we have in New York City is an economic scissors where the housing prices are increasing enormously, but wages, if they're increasing at all, are increasing just a tiny bit. So the scissors remains open. They can't close. It's not income inequality. It's the disproportionate growth of rents and prices and the disproportionate loss of wages. So another political front, which of course our elected officials are aware of, is the fight to raise the minimum wage, make a living wage mandatory, press employers to hire more and pay more.
But I mean, the rents can't be going up. I mean, I agree with you absolutely on that, but the rents can't be going up without somebody to pay them. And there's two pieces to that. You know, you have the masses of people in the city who are still earning the same amount that they did, you know, in nominal dollars from 20, 30 years ago. And you do have this onslaught of people with money, you know. I mean, I think you can't underestimate the degree to which you know, the way that tax policy changes, the way that changes in the economy, the way that everything has created this, you know, block of people who are able to just dominate the market for housing, for everything, in a way that they were not before.
Well, that's the real trickle-down theory. The super rich, global rich, come in and pay $100 million for an apartment. And that knocks the mere super rich down, so they can only pay $50 million for an apartment. And that knocks the rich down, and so on and so forth, till you get down to middle income, low income people who can't even look up from the bottom of that scale.
I think you've just heard a preview of our next town hall, because this is one of those issues that we really do need 2 hours to even begin to get at the root of. So thanks for that question, Professor.
Two elements that are now entering this. One of them is foreign investment in housing in New York City, in housing that is not really occupied. That is a significant number of units. The other is what a lot of people like, which is Airbnb, but are taking a lot of rental units out of the marketplace. And that's very dangerous, particularly in communities like Bedford-Stuyvesant or Park Slope or others, because if you take those units out, they're usually the affordable units, and then you're getting a much higher income by renting them out on a daily basis than you would on a monthly basis. So we really need to regulate Airbnbs coming in, and we really need to figure out how we tax a lot out of, I was going to say a different thing.
The council member was just at a hearing.
Yeah, we just had a huge oversight hearing, 8-hour oversight hearing on Airbnbs, which I will not even begin to address in this short period of time. But you should know that the city is very concerned with those housing units being removed, and we are looking very closely at what Airbnb and other sites like Airbnb are doing. That's the biggest, and that's the face of it. That's the Kleenex of these things. So but I wanted to address the fact that most of my constituents, 9 out of 10 of my constituents, would tell you that they don't want to be in a housing battle over lower. They want a higher wage to pay whatever the market value is, right? And most people, that's what they want. So you hit on a very key issue. Most people are good people. They want to go to work. They want their salary to match what their expenses are. And that's something that we have to continue to look at as a city, because most people, most of my constituents, don't want rent subsidies. They don't want to be taken care of. They want a salary that allows them to be good, productive people and pay the market rent. It's just that it's gotten so out of hand, and nobody's mentioned a very important demographic. That's the middle class, because they're being forced out at a higher rate.
They're still here.
And everybody else. Yeah. No. The middle class are the teachers, the lawyers, the police officer who's forced to go to Long Island or Westchester because he can't come back to Brooklyn. Or Jersey. So we have a real concern, and if you look at it, and if you understand taxes, we know that the middle class is the crux of our tax base. So it's almost counterintuitive to force out that demographic, but inadvertently, I'm being kind, inadvertently they're being forced out. I don't want to make it seem like it's a sinister plot when it may very well be, but nobody is lending a voice to that demographic. So that demographic actually helps a community grow, because they're the teacher,
absolutely,
they're the public servant, they're the social worker, they're the people who are the fabric of society that help build society from within. And without them being present, you know, we're going to get a throwback to the ghettos of far between.
Well, just right before we go into the hour, I know, Neil, you and I had the conversation about foreign investment and how Midtown is owned by these people and there's all these apartments vacant.
When all these buildings went up along, you know, in downtown Brooklyn, right around here, my first thought was, wow, you know, I don't know who's going to live in all those things, but at least it'll draw off all the people who want to move to Brooklyn, and then they will stop moving to our neighborhoods, right? That didn't happen at all. You know, these entire buildings that are owned by, you know, Chinese nationals who are using as investment properties. And it's a huge, huge problem, because, you know, not only do they take up all of this housing, but, you know, they're not working here, they're not paying income taxes, they're not paying sales taxes on the things that they're not shopping at the local stores. There's no reason that I can possibly think of that New York would want to incentivize people to do this.
But
so
we could make a tax plan that would heavily penalize folks who have it for an investment purpose, and it's
we don't like to
empty,
use the P word at all, Brian.
Moving on.
Okay. My name is Reginald Sweeney, and maybe 9 months ago to a year, I was fortunate to go to be involved with a debate, and the gentrification question was huge in Bedford-Stuyvesant. How you doing, Mr. Carnegie? Love, and I respect you, bro. And the anger out of that debate, and I was on the panel because I ran against Mr. Carnegie, was just race. They felt that they stayed in Bed-Stuy for so many years.
Yeah.
No resources for them, crime, no businesses would come. And now I have some folks that are happy in a roundabout way to know that they're seniors, they want to cash out, and that helps them send their grandsons, children to college. So it's a tough issue, but it's a race issue. Let's pray to God that they don't gentrify the public housing.
Yeah.
And let's look at some, I understand that, I just mentioned that. But let's look at some other ways where I see a beautiful, young, progressive audience here where we all need places to live. I'm being priced out. Now, I'm okay with that. But at the same time, you have businesses. You need to really, the minority communities need to focus and appreciate what they have. Watch your crime rates. Keep things down. Because as people come in, I got folks on my block, they're not black, they're white. They say hi every day. We're concerned about the same things. We want to be safe. So is it the great human migration where an apartment in Manhattan is going for $100 million? How can these folks, it's a great push. We're spending $100 billion in Brooklyn. You know, let's try to figure out how we can protect one another, but it is race, it is resources, and it is politics. When you have people that sit in politics, we had a council person for 37 years.
Yeah.
And look what we have in Bedford-Stuyvesant.
Okay.
Being priced
Thank
out.
you
God
so
bless
much.
everyone.
All right, we're going to move to you.
Hi, my name's Serena, and I live in Bushwick. My question is, what would you say? I'm a student, so I'll be here for 2 to 4 years, depending on college. What do you say to transient renters, especially in light of rent stabilization laws that really incentivize landlords to kind of get tenants in and out with the 20% vacancy rates?
How many roommates do you have?
2. There's 3 of us.
Okay. How do you do it?
I think we
what do you say to these
What
do you say to transient folks? She knows that she's here to bang around New York for 3 years and get out. What can she do? How does she do it responsibly without being a jerk? Right?
Yeah. Yeah, just like, especially not even just like new residents, but transient. Like, we'll be here for 4 years tops, maybe.
She couldn't
afford there's a word for that process. It's called studentification. Seriously, and this is the strategy of replacing working class families by students is known around the world where there are colleges. It's not only New York and not only the United States. It's just a very tough situation when you have an ongoing transient population. And the economic development people want more universities and more colleges to establish themselves in New York because they see that as a means of stimulating economic development, of encouraging talented and highly educated young people to come and stay in New York City and not be transients. But the more colleges and the more graduate schools we have in New York City, the more we run into this problem.
I would say get involved in the communities that you temporarily reside in. That's a good way. If you're a college student, you can lend to the fabric of your community by tutoring, by mentoring, by doing any of those kinds of things, and it gives you obviously a good feeling. But it's a boon to the community. So I would say, you're not responsible for your housing. I was a college student. You couldn't tell me anything about my housing. But you can be responsible as a human being, as a citizen, even in temporary status by lending to the community that you're currently residing in.
Yeah, and I think you took the first step to be aware of what are the effects of gentrification and just being more involved, like asking that question, what can I do? That's a first step. Find out what's going on in your building. Are the long-term tenants being harassed? Like, talk to people. Find out what's happening. If there's no tenant association in your building, make one, because you're here and you're aware, you know what's happening. So I follow up on his statement of just get involved in the community, even if you're temporary. You see and you know what's going on. So, you know, be aware and be active.
You wouldn't happen to be in Bed-Stuy by any chance, would you?
No, I'm in Bushwick.
All right, I'm gonna go to you, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Maria Molina. I live in Crown Heights. And just a little shameless plug, I recently published a book called Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Displacement of Minorities in the Process of Gentrification. My question is really about the 2080 split of housing. What I wanted to know is, once that original tenant moves out, does that 20 split revert back to market rate? And secondly, if we're really concerned about desegregating communities, why isn't it a 50-50 split? I'm just for anyone.
All right, I'm just going to answer, but anybody else can answer. But I had a very aggressive plan for a 30-20-50 split, which I think is more equitable, and it allows for the middle class to have some subsidies and a way to stay as well.
What's the 30-20-50? What's the
20% low income, 30% middle income, and 50% market rate.
Gotcha.
In buildings. It helps build a very vibrant and helpful society. Those who are in the proximity of people who are successful have the tendency to rise to a level of success. So from a socioeconomic standpoint, it's good. And then economically, it is good. There's no developer on earth that would do it. And they all told me to kick rocks, but I still am, you know, they can't win in their estimation with that type of a model. And I'm sorry, what was your first question?
Yeah, what's the wonkish part? Like, if someone does leave, does that rejigger the formula?
It's supposed to be the apartment, not the person.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Until it reaches a certain level.
Which is $2,500.
Until it reaches a certain level.
Once they move out.
But I do want to say something about the 50-50 split. I think you're absolutely right. When you're going into a neighborhood where you have a median income, where 50% are making above and 50% are making below, and you're coming in with 80-20, you're immediately gentrifying, no matter what you're doing. What we're doing is even worse, because that 20% today is calculated on the area median income, not the local median income.
Right. And that's the whole East Coast.
No, it's not the whole East Coast. It's Westchester County, northern New Jersey.
Right. So
and so when you're going into places like East New York or Bushwick, where the median income is around $30,000, all of a sudden you're coming in there with $44,000 being the affordable housing. It's significantly higher than the people who live the median income of the people who live next door. So it's 100% gentrification. The mayor's got to rethink his housing program. He really has to. It's got to become a low-income program. He's using a mechanism that was developed, and I think rightly so, to make sure that new development is not segregated. All right, and so it's an integration tool. It's not a tool to provide low and moderate income housing.
Right.
And I'm an advocate of subsidies because we subsidize the wrong people.
Exactly.
We subsidize corporations and we subsidize the wealthy. We don't subsidize the middle and the low income population.
Isn't that a HUD formula, though, and that affects the whole United States, the median, yeah, the area median.
It's distorted in New York.
It's distorted.
It's distorted upward in New York. In other places, it doesn't.
Okay, ma'am, at the mic.
Hi, my name's Lucy Cotine. I live in Fort Greene, and related to thank you, Joe, what she just said, something that has a lot of people in Fort Greene talking about is this article that was in the news, Daily News, saying that the city plans to sell prime real estate for $1 to Jonathan Rose for the property at 15 Lafayette, which is across the street from BAM next to Mark Morris.
Yeah, neighbors.
Now, this developer, Jonathan Rose, many people know he's one of the biggest developers in the area. He's getting millions and millions of dollars worth of property for $1. I don't know how that's possible. In exchange, he's doing a cultural center. He's giving all of 25 units of the apartments out of 73, which will be 60% below AMI, and then another 24 units, which will be 130% AMI. And we know they don't even have to put those units in that particular property, right? That's the law. They can be anywhere, I don't know, I think it's within a mile, right? How can we change this? This 80-20 business is a red herring. This affordable housing where somebody like Jonathan Rose, who's going to get 421A and not pay taxes.
The question is, how can we change it?
This is outrageous.
Is there a ready answer? Is this something that we need to go to the steps of City Hall to empower you to act on, or is this something that we have to kick up to Albany because the City Council has its limits? Where are we to put our bodies and intentions into rejiggering that figure?
So I would, initially I would say, definitely talk to your council member in that district. Hold on, take it easy. But the only reason I'm saying that is because I'm not familiar with that specific project.
I did that. I called my, Lori Cumbo, who's here, by the way. I called her office today and said, what's Lori's take on this? Is she going to, the person I spoke to, Drew, didn't know about this deal. So.
And the only reason I mentioned it is because I'm not aware of the deal, and I think I would be speaking out of turn if I tried to address that particular.
Can I just say, this is just one deal. This is just one bad deal, but it's,
we fully understand, and we could go on, but we
hearing
really
of
got to get over
affordable
here.
housing to put luxury, really basically luxury, high-rise.
That's why we're here.
Neil,
quickly. We're going to get you an answer.
Really quick, one thing that I've seen over and over and over again in all these neighborhoods is the degree to which the developers are setting the agenda for the city, and it baffles me, and I would love, to hear from everyone here,
And because of Rebney and things like that, they're buying.
I'm sorry, right here. We need you to talk.
Yes, good evening, panel.
Come back to it.
Honorable Robert Koenig.
What's your question?
I have a comment, and it's a very important comment. I'm a youth coach for the last 10 years. I service Fort Greene, Brooklyn Pit Bulls, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Crown Heights. So right now there's an act, I do football. My primary sport right now is football. So football at this present time is getting a bad rap. I do Pop 1 of football. We have a lot of rules, and I've been very fortunate for the 10 years of running my program. One concussion, and it was a cheap shot.
Gentrification.
Right, so we're getting to that. So anyway, they have a act called the Safety Act that's in City Council right now, where youth football programs, if they're going to have a game, has to have a doctor, which I already did. We do 3 games a day. It's $150 an hour.
I know it's coming before you in the city council, right?
Right, and I was at the first hearing. My point is, they're not going to give.
Yeah.
Now, in Brooklyn, it's predominantly black, and I would say about 95% of football field on public parks. If these youth programs who are strapped for money already do not have the funding to get a doctor at games or at practices, they will not be permitted, they will not be given a permit to use the fields. So basically, through financial expense, most of these programs will be pushed out of the parks.
So this is a question of cultural gentrification.
I'm sorry?
Cultural gentrification, not using the public spaces.
Right, exactly. So what we're saying is, when you see the articles in the paper, please try to see the side of the programs that we are with the safety of the children, but at the same time, financially, this will be a burden on the programs, and we will be back in the street, as one president said that was at the committee hearing, that our kids will be recruited not from football programs but gangs again. So we want to keep them on the field, and we're helping them get into schools and colleges, and we've been doing a great job for the last 20 years.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ogechi, and I live in Brownsville. I am a current teaching resident, so I'm yet to enter the classroom, but I'm very curious. When we talk about the price of gentrification, I'm wondering what that looks like or what that means for children of color who are in neighborhoods that are soon to be gentrified. What will be the impact of the current gentrification on children in the future if the teachers who maybe look like them can't afford to live where they live right now? Like, how does that change the educational landscape?
Should we start with the teachers or the council member?
Well, I think someone on the panel spoke earlier about middle class people, teachers, firefighters, police officers, who for years have been priced out of living in the city. I mean, some of them leave because they want to, but a lot of them leave because it's just too expensive to live in the city. maybe through more community control of planning. There has to be housing in the city for teachers, for police officers.
Yeah.
For
So just to go to you, council member, you do represent a district that has $1 million brownstones, people who've been holding on to those properties for generations or more, and folks who've just moved in at that price level, and some almost abject poverty. How do you serve those constituencies and go to the core of that question of keeping the community that had been historically what it was to look that way and improve into the future?
Well, currently we're working on a very large project that includes affordable housing, but it also includes housing for teaching professionals. And today I was just with the Commissioner of Parks and Rec, and have been in talks with EDC and Kyle Kimball to make this project come to fruition, which is a 500,000 square foot project right in the heart of Bedford-Stuyvesant, but that would meet the need of who we believe are some of the most valuable members, which are teachers. So we're looking to kind of carve out, through a very innovative project, housing for teaching professionals. And it's a long, tough fight. Some of the pushback that we're getting makes it a little bit difficult, but we're committed to doing that, understanding the value of that. I don't know about throughout the city how we're going to make that happen, but we have the opportunity to put forward a very innovative program that allows for a great degree of housing to be available to people who have identified themselves as teaching professionals.
So before we go to this gentleman who is going to be our last audience person who's standing, as we open this up, a lot of the questions have gone back to the central question of race at the core. And I don't want anyone to go home tonight thinking that we're afraid to say the race thing, or we're not looking at this thing in totality. We're our community. We can have a respectful dialogue and conversation about where race enters this conversation. So I want to ask you guys to just address that head on. We talked about those working definitions, but is gentrification as simple as a white guy moved in next door to where black folk and brown people have been living this whole time?
Is that coupled with broken windows policing? That makes it very difficult. And Brian, I thought you were going to let me not have to bring up broken windows policing in this particular panel, but obviously it plays a tremendous part in addition to being priced out and those kinds of things. So what it feels like to a black male in a community that's being gentrified and that he's being priced out, stop and frisked, a broken windows policing, really psychologically is so it really impedes upon Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is something that I won't even get into that today, but it lends to not having somebody reach the highest level of Maslow's needs, food safety, and those kinds of things that never get addressed.
Just to add to that, I would say it's race and class. You cannot take either of them out of the equation. Obviously, if we did not have the huge inequality of class in this city, gentrification would not be happening this way. If we did not have the racial issues we did in this city, gentrification would look very, very, very different.
I just wanted to add something to that, because I think we need to dare to change the language, right? Because we can have this conversation on affordable housing, but the reality is affordable housing for who?
Right.
Right? And we can't be afraid to change the language, because when we talk about income inequality, when we talk about race, sometimes those of us that make enough to at least survive forget the people under us, the ones that can't afford to stay at all. So I think we need to change some of the terminology, and I know we want to drive the incomes to the point where we can be self-sustaining and do what we got to do on our own without any subsidies or whatever. But we have to remember the folks that can't fight for themselves. That we need to change the language to talk about low-income housing, and that doesn't always have to look like projects.
So let's, Professor, let's shift that dialectic right now. What are the words that we should be saying? Let's language ourselves into a better understanding on the way to a solution.
I'd like to go back to something I said right at the very beginning, and that the real issue is who benefits from the policies that are taking place. I remember when disinvestment was destroying African American, black communities, and poor communities.
Right.
And that has to be addressed. The lack of investment hurt people. The overheated investment is hurting people. So it's how we guide that policy, how we walk that double-edged sword that really becomes critical. I've worked in communities lately, East New York, Bushwick, where people don't want to see improvements in the neighborhood. They don't want to see better parks because they're afraid if we get a park and we get a cultural institution and we have safer streets all of a sudden,
attract them.
We're going to be pushed out.
Yeah.
That's not a paradigm that we can accept. We can't accept poorer neighborhoods. We've gone through policies of environmental injustices and the burdening of low-income communities for a long time. We have to find a way to balance the investment in such a way that poor people don't suffer from that over time. And I think that's really got to be the critical issue. It's not gentrification. It's really overinvestment where the victims are poor people.
This is our literal last minute.
Okay, last question, I guess, and I'll get right to it. I want to make one quick remark, address something that that occurred. My name is Ethan Pettit. I live in Park Slope, and I moved to Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in the '80s. I want to address one topic that was discussed for a minute, which is, that is to say that activists, local activists, people who are from the neighborhood, do initiate gentrification, unwittingly, inadvertently. But it absolutely happens, because when I moved to Williamsburg in the '80s, you know, you had gunfights all night long. They didn't stop the gunfights because we moved in. You know, out of respect for a bunch of artists, 200 artists maybe at that time. It was the local activists. It was places like El Puente and Los Sures, and it was the local Latino activists mostly who pulled that neighborhood back from the brink. Yeah. You know, in the very early '80s. So you guys, you know, anything that improves the neighborhood makes the neighborhood more desirable, and people want to move there, whether, you know, with whatever intentions. But that was certainly the case back then. It wasn't the few hundred artists who gentrified it. Now, Mike, we're now going to get right to my question, which is for the councilman. You're talking about incentivizing landlords and trying to keep them in some kind of a program where they maintain, you know, reasonably priced. Yeah. So you know, I'm sensing that you are vastly underestimating.
We are literally out of time.
Okay, so what are you doing? This is my question. What are you doing to what are you going to? How is this program going to work? What are you going to do? Go to the landlords.
Okay,
and ask them to.
In our last moment, so we're going to have this conversation offline. I invite all of you to stay to continue the dialogue. But we are closing up our broadcast hours as we speak now. But this conversation will continue here and online and at our kitchen tables. Remember to #BeHeard. And we're here every day doing a show at noon where we do discuss these issues and invite you to participate in BK Live as it airs. Thank you so much to our panelists, our broadcast partner at WBAI. Thank you all for being here and sharing your thoughts. Thank you for coming. We appreciate it. And we'll see you next time here. Thank you.